Across the fractured ruins of Europe, a cacophony of celebration erupted. Church bells, long silent under the shadow of war, pealed with a frantic joy. Rifles cracked, firing not in anger, but in exultation, their reports echoing through streets where banners proclaimed a day of liberation. For tens of millions, it marked the end of 6 years of total, consuming war. But for a group of young women standing in the grimy twilight of German railway yards, this day signified something profoundly different. Their uniforms, threadbare remnants of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, the Helferinnen, were stained with the memory of retreat. Their boots were cracked, their unwashed hair matted after weeks of flight. Some were barely 20, their faces still holding the ghost of youth beneath layers of soot and bone-deep fatigue. They had been the invisible cogs in a vast military machine, secretaries, typists, radio operators known as Blitzmittel and nurses. They were the women who had connected generals, plotted coordinates, and manned anti-aircraft searchlights, their labor essential to a war that had devoured their nation and now collapsed in their hands. With the Reich broken and their leaders dead or captured, they were being herded onto trains, not for a triumphant homecoming, but for the chilling uncertainty of captivity. The image was a surreal tableau. Long lines of women in gray-green skirts and jackets, dragging battered suitcases or clutching small bundles, stepped into the dark maws of the same wooden boxcars that had once carried cheering soldiers to the front. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, sweat, and a pervasive, unspoken dread. Some clutched rosaries, their lips moving in silent prayer. Others held onto ration tins, a final vestige of a collapsed order. Many held nothing at all. A girl from Hamburg, her face pale and drawn, whispered to her companion, "The Americans will not spare us. They will make examples of us." She had heard it from a Luftwaffe officer in the final, chaotic hours of surrender, his words a parting curse. Another woman, taller and more hardened by years, spent mapping the paths of Allied bombers, said nothing. Her jaw was set, a mask of defiance bracing for an inevitable blow. Propaganda had been their daily bread. For years, they had been told that the Allies, and the Americans in particular, were not men but wolves, driven by a lust for vengeance. Captivity, they were assured, would mean degradation, cruelty, and fates worse than a soldier's death on the battlefield. The train lurched into motion, its wheels groaning as it rumbled westward through a landscape of apocalypse. Charred towns drifted past the grimy slats of the boxcar like phantoms. Churches stood as hollowed-out shells, their steeples gone, pointing like accusing fingers at a vacant sky. Bridges, their steel spines broken, folded grotesquely into the murky waters of rivers. Skeletal factories, where smoke still smoldered from recent bombings, stood as monuments to a dead industry. From the embankments, children with faces as thin as paper watched the train pass, their expressions unreadable. At night, when the train would halt with a screech of metal on metal, the women huddled against one another for warmth. They listened to the heavy tread of the guards' boots outside and the occasional, sharp crack of gunfire in the far distance, a sound that made their hearts hammer against their ribs. One woman, Anna, a former secretary from Munich with intelligent eyes that had seen too much, wrote in a small diary she had miraculously kept hidden. "We are being taken far," she scrawled in the faint light filtering through the cracks. "None knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps it is better if she does. Perhaps I will be." The journey ended not in a bleak German camp, but in the sprawling, chaotic ports of Bremen and Le Havre, where massive ships waited under the stark colors of the American flag. The women were marched down the gangways, past soldiers whose expressions they could not decipher. Some looked on with simple curiosity, others with a flat indifference that was somehow more unnerving than open hostility. The women had braced themselves for snarls, for insults, for blows. Instead, they were met with a strange, impersonal order, with paperwork, clipboards, and lines. They were counted, tagged like livestock, and divided into groups. It felt less like the vengeance of conquerors, and more like a bizarre, incomprehensible bureaucracy. Still, as the ship's massive engines groaned to life and the coastline of their broken Europe shrank into a hazy line on the horizon, a profound dread settled deep into their bones. The Atlantic stretched before them, gray, wide, and endless. And on the other side of that abyss, America, mysterious, distant, a land built of enemy caricatures and wartime myth waited. The journey across the Atlantic began not with a sense of passage, but with a descent into a clamorous, metallic belly. The women were led down steep ladders into steel holds where bunks were stacked 3 or 4 high, so close together that one could feel the breath of the person above. The air was a suffocating cocktail of salt, damp wool, diesel fumes, and the sour tang of collective fear. For days, the rhythmic groaning of the ship's hull and the constant, churning motion of the sea was their entire world. Seasickness gripped the majority, a relentless nausea that left them weak and pale in their narrow bunks, the misery, a physical manifestation of their uprooted lives. Then came the first meal. American guards, their faces impassive, carried large trays down the aisles. On them were slabs of pale bread, portions of meat slick with gravy, and steaming mugs of dark, fragrant coffee. The women stared in stunned disbelief. This was not the thin, watery soup or the ersatz bread made from sawdust and barley that had been their sustenance for years. This was food, real food. A collective hesitation fell over the hold. Whispers rippled through the gloom. It is a trick. Poison. They want to fatten us before the slaughter. Years of propaganda had conditioned them to expect nothing but malice from their captors. One woman, her face gaunt, picked up a slice of bread as if it were a venomous creature. She sniffed it, her eyes wide with suspicion. Anna watched her, her own stomach aching with a hunger so profound it had become a part of her. She took a piece of bread and, before she could lose her nerve, took a bite. It was soft, dense, and real. The taste was so overwhelming, so alien after years of deprivation, that tears welled in her eyes. She ate it quickly, as if afraid it might be snatched away. Around her, others followed suit. Some devoured the meal with a desperate ferocity, tears rolling down their faces and mixing with the gravy on their chins. Others ate slowly, methodically, as if committing the sensation to memory. The coffee, hot and strong, was a jolt to their exhausted systems. It was a luxury beyond comprehension. A girl from Dresden whispered in astonishment, her voice cracking, "They feed us like they feed themselves." The statement hung in the thick air, a truth more unsettling than any threat. It was not kindness they had been led to expect. It was punishment, humiliation, a methodical breaking of their spirit. Yet here was a different, baffling reality. This was not a gesture of compassion. It felt like procedure, an impersonal efficiency that provided for enemies the same sustenance it provided for its own. This detached, bureaucratic provision of care unsettled them more profoundly than overt cruelty ever could have. It defied the simple black and white logic of where they had been taught, introducing a shade of gray so vast it threatened to swallow them whole. When at last the churning of the sea subsided, they were allowed on deck. They stumbled into the blinding light, clutching the rails, their eyes watering in the sharp, clean wind. And then they saw it. Rising from the mist, a skyline of impossible towers that scraped the clouds, untouched by a single bomb. It was a city from a dream, a testament to a power so immense it felt supernatural. And there, guarding the harbor, stood the colossal, green-robed figure of a woman holding a torch aloft. The Statue of Liberty. The irony was so bitter, so absolute, that it drew no smiles, only a deep, hollow silence. A monument to freedom, greeting a ship full of prisoners. Crowds lined the piers as the great ship was maneuvered into its berth. Some faces in the crowd were contorted with jeers, shouting words the women could not understand, but whose venom was unmistakable. Others simply watched, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The women were marched ashore in columns, their cracked boots echoing on the solid wooden planks. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, salted by the ocean, but untainted by the ever-present ash of war that had perfumed their lives for years. For the first time, in the shadow of that indomitable skyline, some of them began to grasp the true, terrifying scale of their defeat. Germany was rubble, a continent of ghosts and ruins. America was intact, prosperous, terrifyingly, vibrantly alive. Buses and trains, their engines rumbling with a steady, unhurried power, carried them inland. They traveled through a country that seemed to exist in another dimension, a parallel world untouched by the ravages that had consumed their own. The roads unfurled before them like gray ribbons, flanked by lush green fields and prosperous towns, where children on bicycles waved as they passed and houses gleamed with white porches. To women who had watched their own cities burn under the relentless rain of Allied bombs, whose last visual memories were of cratered streets and skeletal buildings, the sight was almost incomprehensible, a waking dream that bordered on hallucination. They whispered among themselves in the swaying vehicles, their voices hushed with awe and disbelief. Was this truly the land of the monsters? Could such abundance be real? The Reich had promised them a glorious victory and delivered only ruins. The enemy they had been taught to despise, and fear seemed to live in a universe of impossible peace and plenty. Their destinations were camps built across the vastness of the United States, Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, and dozens more like them. At the gates, crowned with the familiar menacing blossom of barbed wire, their names were recorded, their few possessions catalogued, and their worn Wehrmacht uniforms were exchanged for plain, coarse work clothes. But before they could be assigned to a barrack and settle into the grim reality of imprisonment, there was one final mandatory step. The guards, their demeanor firm but not brutal, directed them toward a long, low building set apart from the others. Inside, steam hissed from pipes along the ceiling and water dripped with a hollow echo. It was the delousing station, though the women did not yet know its name. Their hearts began to pound a frantic, suffocating rhythm against their ribs. This was it. This must be the place of humiliation, of degradation, the beginning of the systematic cruelty they had been warned about for years. In the long, shuffling line, terrified whispers circled like smoke. This is where they will make us suffer. Remember what they told us. One clutched her battered suitcase as if it were a shield. Another crossed herself silently, her eyes squeezed shut. The line moved with agonizing slowness, and as each woman stepped through the doorway into the tiled room, her lifetime of carefully constructed expectations collided violently with reality. They were handed bars of soap. Not the gritty, lye-based cakes they had known in Germany, but real soap. Thick, white, heavy in the hand. It smelled faintly and impossibly of flowers. Towels followed clean, fluffy, and white. Then clean undergarments. The guards pointed towards a row of showerheads. With trembling hands, the women turned the knobs. Streams of hot, steaming water, a luxury more precious than gold poured down, washing away months of accumulated grime, sweat, and the clinging dust of their fallen nation. The sound of weeping began, echoing off the wet tiles. Some women cried openly, great, heaving sobs of relief and confusion, their bodies shaking as the hot water sluiced over their skin. Others began to laugh, high, nervous peals of disbelief that bordered on hysteria. For the first time in years, they felt truly clean, their hair free of lice, their skin scrubbed raw and pink. It was not humiliation, but an act of profound restoration. And it shook them to their very core, leaving them more vulnerable and disarmed than any beating could have. That night, Anna wrote again in her diary, her handwriting trembling across the page under the dim light of the barracks. We were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, we were given soap. A bar of soap that smells of flowers. How can this be? She did not yet know that this moment, this simple elemental act of washing, would remain etched in her memory with more clarity and force than the war itself. The women lay in their bunks, hair still damp from the showers, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of starch and clean cotton. Outside, the American night hummed with the sound of crickets, a peaceful chorus, worlds away from the thunder of guns. They whispered to one another, their voices low but urgent, as if sharing a secret too fragile, too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. Perhaps there was something here that neither propaganda nor fear could ever explain. What awaited them in the days to come, the food, the work, the encounters with Americans, would astonish them even further. For now, though, one image lingered in every mind, the soap in their hands, slippery, fragrant, absurdly gentle. It was only the beginning of their captivity. Yet it already felt like the beginning of something else entirely. The buses rolled through gates crowned with barbed wire, their engines grumbling as dust rose in pale clouds across the camp road. To the women inside, the sight was at once frightening and strangely orderly. Guard towers stood at intervals, their silhouettes sharp against the vast American sky. Soldiers lounged nearby, rifles slung with a casualness that seemed alien. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in neat, geometric lines across the fields. This was not the gray, chaotic brutality of a concentration camp as depicted in their own newsreels. This was something bewilderingly, unnervingly different. The buildings were painted, the paths were swept, and the fences, while intact, seemed less menacing than procedural. The prisoners looked at one another, sharing silent glances that asked the same question: what world have we stepped into? As they were filed off the bus, each woman was handed a number tag. American officers moved with a clipped, bureaucratic efficiency, scribbling notes on clipboards and stamping documents with a decisive thud. The women stiffened, their bodies tensing for the insults or harsh orders that felt overdue. Yet the guards spoke with a disarming calmness, their English tones softened by Southern draws or Midwestern flatness. For many, the first shock came not from cruelty, but from a profound indifference. The Americans treated them neither as monsters to be reviled nor as guests to be welcomed, but as something strangely ordinary, prisoners of war to be managed, catalogued, and housed. The delousing station had already unsettled them with its unexpected civility, but what followed was stranger still. After the showers, they were led into a mess hall. The long room smelled powerfully of coffee, baking bread, and meat frying in grease. The women froze in the doorway, momentarily disoriented by the smell alone. Long tables stretched across the hall, already set with trays of food, boiled potatoes, carrots, a rich beef stew, and soft rolls gleaming with a sheen of butter. Steam from the serving line fogged the windows, and the aroma was thick and overwhelming, an assault of abundance. A guard motioned them forward. Reluctantly, they shuffled to the counter. A cook in a white apron, his face ruddy from the heat, dropped spoonfuls of stew onto tin plates, slid slices of bread alongside, and filled mugs with coffee, all with an air of practiced monotony. The women accepted the trays as though they were handling explosives. Some could not meet the cook's eye. Others stared down at the food, unsure if it was real. In Germany, the final winter of war had reduced meals to black bread stretched with sawdust, watery turnip soup, and, if one was lucky, a scrap of horse meat. Now, in the heart of an enemy camp, they were being given more in a single meal than they had seen in weeks. Anna, her diary tucked safely under her new mattress, sat with her tray at a long table. She dipped her spoon into the stew, watching the beads of fat float on the surface, the chunks of meat glistening. Tentatively, she tasted it. Her eyes widened, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, a gesture of involuntary shock and shame. Around her, other women hesitated, then began to eat in a heavy silence, broken only by the scrape of cutlery against tin. For some, tears slid unbidden down their cheeks, dripping into their stew. One whispered to her neighbor, her voice thick with emotion, "My brothers starved in the snow at Stalingrad, and here they feed us like this." It was not kindness they had been promised by their own leaders, but humiliation. And yet, the humiliation never came. There were no taunts, no jeering guards watching them eat. The sentries paced slowly up and down the aisles, their gazes filled with professional detachment. One young soldier, hardly older than many of the women themselves, even offered a small, crooked smile as he passed, as if to reassure them. They had steeled themselves for cruelty, but this quiet, procedural civility was somehow more disturbing. It chipped away at the foundations of their hatred. In the days that followed, life in the camp revealed further shocks. Each morning they were woken by a bell-issued breakfast and assigned light duties. Some worked in the kitchens, others in the vast fields nearby, and some, like Anna, were assigned to laundries where American uniforms were scrubbed and pressed. They were paid small wages in camp scrip, a special currency that could be used to buy items at the post exchange or canteen. There, on plain wooden shelves, lay goods from a forgotten world, chocolate bars, cigarettes, pencils, even lipstick. The women stood before these items, as though at an altar. A bar of chocolate was a miracle. A tube of lipstick, an unthinkable extravagance. And yet here, the enemy offered it to them in exchange for their work. The irony was a torment. Back in Germany, their families scavenged for scraps in the ruins of their cities. Letters, when they managed to trickle through the censors, were filled with a quiet, desperate despair. One woman read hers aloud by candlelight, her voice trembling. "We live in the cellar now. The house above is destroyed. We boil weeds for soup. If you have anything, send it." She folded the thin paper with shaking fingers, knowing she could not send food back, only words. The gulf between their suffering homeland and the strange abundance of the camp widened with each passing day. Shame, heavier than any chains, began to settle upon them. They were enemies, yet they were fed, clothed, and sheltered. The Reich had demanded their absolute loyalty, sent them to man radios and spotlights, but gave them hunger and ruins in return. America, the sworn enemy, gave them soap and stew. At night, lying awake and listening to the crickets, they wondered what it meant. Not all adjusted easily. A few resisted, refusing to eat more than the bare minimum, hoarding bread crusts under pillows, convinced the generosity was a trick. Rumors spread that the food was drugged, that the soap contained some hidden sterilizing agent. Yet as day followed day, nothing happened except the quiet, relentless routine of camp life. Their bodies fattened, their skin cleared, the lice vanished. Slowly, suspicion yielded to a reluctant, bewildering acceptance. The greatest cruelty, it seemed, was to be treated with a dignity they felt they no longer deserved. Anna captured the conflict in her diary with painful clarity. "I eat, and my stomach thanks me. I sleep, and my body grows strong. Yet each kindness cuts me deeper. How do I reconcile this with the faces of the children in Munich who drink water for supper? To be brutalized would have been simple. It would have affirmed everything they had been taught. To be treated with dignity by those they were told were beasts, that was unbearable. They no longer feared being broken by cruelty. They feared being undone by kindness." The weeks settled into a rhythm, and in that rhythm, the women began to lose track of time. Morning bell, breakfast line, work detail, supper, lights out. Yet beneath the placid surface of routine, a strange transformation stirred. At first, they had counted the days like all prisoners do, scratching mental tallies into the walls of their minds. But gradually, the sharp edge of their captivity dulled, replaced by a quiet, persistent bewilderment. They were captives, yes, but they were also fed, clothed, and even paid. For women raised in a collapsing Reich, where loyalty was rewarded with hunger and sacrifice with oblivion, this inversion gnawed at their thoughts more persistently than any barbed wire fence. And then came the day they were taken outside the wire, not as a transfer, but for work details in the nearby towns. The women rode in the open beds of military trucks, their hands gripping the wooden sideboards as they passed through the gates. The world, America, was not only intact, it was flourishing. The townsfolk watched them pass with a mixture of expressions. Some stared with cold curiosity, others with a flat indifference. Children pointed openly, their faces alight with the simple fascination of seeing something new. What struck the women most was not hostility, but the sheer, uninterrupted flow of life. American life moved on, unbroken. Radios blared jazz and baseball scores from open windows. For women from cities where the only sound had been sirens and falling bombs, this symphony of the mundane was almost unbearable. One afternoon, after hours spent harvesting cotton under the hot Georgia sun, Anna's group was taken to a church hall where local volunteers had prepared their lunch. The long tables groaned with platters of sandwiches, bowls of fresh fruit, and slices of pie. The women hesitated, their hands hovering over the food as if afraid it might vanish. An elderly American woman, a dusting of flour on her apron, smiled gently and urged them, "Eat, eat." Anna picked up an apple, its skin a perfect, glossy red. It was crisp and sweet, the juice exploding in her mouth. And that night, back in the quiet of the camp, the barracks buzzed with whispers, heavier and more troubled than before. Did you see the cars, the bread in the bakery? It was white. The houses. None of them are touched. For some, the shock of America's abundance was intoxicating, a glimpse of a world they thought no longer existed. For others, it was the final, unbearable proof of Germany's total and utter collapse. The Reich that had promised them an empire to last 1,000 years had bequeathed them only ashes. The enemy had delivered the world of plenty their own leaders had sworn was a decadent lie. It was a truth too large to swallow, too sharp to ignore. The conflict, once external, now turned completely inward. In the quiet darkness of their bunks, loyalty battled with reality, pride with a strange, reluctant gratitude, and hatred with a dawning, painful admiration. This was no longer a clash of armies, but a slow, agonizing erosion of belief. Each bar of chocolate, each hot shower, and now, each glimpse of an unbroken American street chipped away at the fortress of propaganda they had lived inside for a decade. The women began to realize that the Reich had not only lied to them about the enemy, it had stolen their very vision of the world itself. As the crickets sang outside the wire and the camp lights glowed like pale moons, they understood that survival was no longer the only question. The real challenge now lay in confronting what their captivity had revealed about the enemy, about their homeland, and most terrifyingly, about themselves. Autumn leaves, crisp and golden, drifted across the camp yard, catching in the barbs of the wire fences. The season had turned, though time inside the camp felt strangely fluid. Its passage marked less by calendars than by the rhythm of meals, work, and the sporadic arrival of letters from home. For months, the women had lived with the shock of survival in America, their days filled with soap bread and a baffling procedural civility. But now came the harder reckoning, what all of this meant for who they had been and who they might become. Anna sat on the barack steps one evening, her diary balanced on her knees. She wrote by the fading light, her words sharper now, as though she could no longer contain the conflict churning within. "I have eaten more in captivity than in all the winters of the Reich," she wrote. "I have slept without fear of bombs, and yet my heart is not at peace. What kind of world is it where the enemy shows more dignity than our own?" Her handwriting trembled. She paused, hearing a burst of laughter from a nearby group of women. They were trading pieces of candy, teasing one another about lipstick shades bought from the canteen, their voices bright, as if the war had never touched them. Anna envied their momentary lightness, but she could not join in. Her loyalty to her broken homeland weighed on her like a shroud, even as it was slipping through her fingers. The Americans, for their part, had grown accustomed to their unlikely prisoners. Some guards stopped seeing them as symbols of a hated regime and began to recognize them as individuals, frail, stubborn, bewildered. A few would share cigarettes, passing them silently across the wire. A gesture, the greatest shock, however, lay not in food or work, but in the mirror. The women's bodies had changed. Their faces filled out, hair regained its luster, and color returned to their cheeks. They looked healthier, stronger, some even younger, as though captivity had peeled away the years of war. To see themselves restored in this way was a source of profound, almost unbearable guilt. It forced them to confront how deeply the Reich had failed them. The enemy had made them healthy. Their own nation had made them starve. It was not just a revelation. It was an indictment. And so, even as they adjusted, even as laughter returned, a new unease hung over everything. They knew this gilded cage could not last forever. One day, they would be sent home, to Germany, to the rubble, to families waiting in despair. The thought of leaving abundance for hunger, of trading soap for soot, filled them with a cold dread. More than one woman whispered it in the dark of the barracks, "I am afraid to go back." It was a treasonous thought, but it was true. As winter neared, rumors of repatriation spread like a virus through the camp, filling the barracks with a tense, anxious energy. What awaited them in the ruins? Would their families even recognize them, well-fed, clean, cheeks glowing with the health of captivity? Some dreaded the judgment in a mother's eyes, the silent accusation that they had lived well while others starved. Anna, staring at her diary, wrote the words she had never dared to think before. "I fear leaving more than I feared arriving." The confession chilled her, but it was honest. The enemy's greatest weapon had not been guns or bombs. It had been soap, food, and a maddening dignity. And those things had done what hatred never could. They had changed her. One morning, as frost laced the camp fences in silver, the announcement came. A transport would be departing for Europe. The women crowded together, hearts pounding, their eyes wide with questions they could not voice. To return meant facing hunger, ruins, and the ghosts of all they had once believed. To stay meant captivity, but also life. An American officer stood before them, reading names from a list, his voice flat and impersonal. But to the women, every syllable landed like a thunderclap. And as Anna heard her name called, as she stepped forward into the cold morning light, she realized the true war was no longer between nations. It was inside her, in the space where hatred had once lived, and where something new, fragile, dangerous, undeniable had begun to grow.